Her father's hands were still covered in her blood when the 22nd surgeon walked away. Monitors kept beeping in that cruel, steady rhythm, but no one touched the little girl on the bed. Outside the glass, white coats moved like ghosts who had already decided a future they didn't have to live in. The girl's name was Emily, 9 years old, freckles fading under the hospital lights, hair shaved in a quick, clumsy line where they'd tried to place one last four. Her chest rose and fell in shallow waves, as if each breath was a negotiation with something bigger than the room. On the screen above her, numbers dipped and climbed, drawing a graph of a life on the edge. Her father stood close enough to feel the warmth still clinging to her skin, close enough to see the way her eyelashes trembled whenever the pain twisted deeper inside. The last surgeon, Dr. Blake, had left the room without looking back. In the hallway, his voice carried through the partially closed door, low but sharp, slicing through the hope that still held the father upright. The tumors wrapped around the major vessels. Brainstem compromise. It's a suicide mission. I won't be responsible for killing her on the table. Then footsteps, quick and decisive, like someone escaping a fire they refused to fight. Daniel Hayes, the man with blood on his hands and a hospital bracelet digging into his wrist, didn't move. His palms still pressed against the rail of the bed, knuckles pale, fingers trembling. Minutes earlier he had carried his daughter from the back of an ambulance, her small body limp in his arms after the seizure that wouldn't stop. Now he stood in the bright, refrigerated calm of the pediatric ICU, realizing that the room was not a sanctuary. It was a waiting room between decisions. On the far side of the glass, a cluster of surgeons gathered under the harsh ceiling lights. Their faces were tired, lined with the weight of years and lawsuits and midnight operations that didn't end the way families had prayed for. They were not heartless. Their eyes gave them away, but they were afraid. Not of blood, not of anatomy, not of the tumor twisting like a dark knot inside Emily's skull, but of the moment when everything they knew how to do wouldn't be enough. At the center of that group stood Dr. Evelyn Hart, head of neurosurgery. Her arms were folded, not to keep herself distant, but to hold herself together. She had been the one to order the last scan, the one to stand silently as the image bloomed onto the monitor, revealing just how far the tumor had reached. It wrapped around arteries and nerves like a fist, threatening to crush whatever hope was left if they tried to open it. She knew every millimeter of that territory. She had mapped it in her mind the moment she saw the image. She also knew what would happen if she tried and failed. Evelyn's eyes lifted from the scan to the glass, to the father watching them like a drowning man watching people argue about whether the water was too deep to jump in. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. His expression said everything, more eloquent than any words. If she dies without a chance, I will carry that silence for the rest of my life. You can walk away. I can't. Down the hall, half inside the shadow of a supply closet door, someone else was watching. A man in a faded blue uniform, cart beside him, mop standing idle like a forgotten soldier at attention. His name tag was scuffed, the letters beginning to peel, but still readable, Sam. The staff knew him as the night janitor, who'd taken extra shifts whenever someone called off, the man who hummed old songs under his breath as he cleaned OR floors hours after the surgeons had gone home. No one noticed that he rarely looked at the clock, but always looked at the hands of the surgeons when they passed by, as if their fingers held a story only he could read. Sam's gaze rested on the image of Emily's brain visible through the open doorway, where the scan still glowed on the monitor. To anyone else, it was a blur of gray and white, lines and shadows. To him, it was a place he'd once lived inside, a landscape he'd traversed for years with a scalpel in his hand instead of a mop. His throat tightened. He shifted his weight, and the wheels of his cart squeaked softly on the polished floor, a sound swallowed instantly by the murmur of doctors' voices. No one noticed he was there. That was the first rule of his job now. Be invisible. Invisible when he changed the liners in the biohazard bins. Invisible when he wiped dried blood off stainless steel. Invisible when he stood in the corner of an empty OR, remembering the way his name had once echoed through other hospitals, followed by the word genius or reckless, depending on who was speaking and what they had lost. The meeting of surgeons dissolved slowly, like a dream that didn't want to admit it was ending. One by one, they drifted away, the glow of their pagers pulling them toward other crises where the lines were clearer, the odds kinder. Evelyn remained, her hand pressed against the glass, her fingers white at the tips. She looked back at Emily, then at Daniel, Somewhere behind the professional mask, something fragile was cracking. A nurse approached Daniel, voice soft, hands steady in that trained way that came from years of standing between families and the worst news of their lives. She spoke to him about options, about time, about preparing for outcomes that no parent wanted to imagine. Her words were careful, chosen, but they still landed like cold stones in his chest. Palliative measures, comfort care, supportive treatment. Each term translated into the same unbearable sentence: we are giving up on trying to save her. Daniel finally pulled his hands away from the bed rail. Blood, half-dried, ringed his fingernails. He stared at it as if the answer might be hidden in the rust-colored crescents. He had carried Emily through her childhood with those hands, teaching her to walk along the edge of the sofa, pushing her bicycle when she thought she couldn't pedal uphill, holding her when fever spiked at 2 a.m. Those same hands were now empty, powerless, offered up to a system that kept answering no. Sam watched him from the shadows and felt something old, something he had tried to bury under layers of ammonia and bleach, begin to stir. It was that restless instinct that had once kept him awake for 36 hours in a row, standing under bright lights while a life depended on the steadiness of his fingers. It was the memory of a very different room, a very different girl, and a mistake that had rewritten his future with brutal finality. Inside the ICU, Emily's eyelids fluttered. Her gaze unfocused, then sharpened just enough to find the shape of her father's shoulders. Her lips parted, dry and cracked. No sound came out, only a breath, but Daniel leaned close, desperate to catch every fragment of her consciousness while he still could. She didn't ask if she was going to die. Children rarely did, not like adults imagined. Instead, her eyes flicked toward the window, toward the world beyond the machines, and then back to him, as if asking a simpler, harder question. Are you still here? I'm here, he whispered, voice raw, barely more than air. I'm not going anywhere. Outside, Evelyn turned away from the glass at last. She walked toward the staff room with the rigid posture of someone who couldn't afford to let their back bend, because if it did, the rest of them might collapse. On her way, she passed Sam. For the briefest second, she glanced at him. Their eyes met, and something like recognition flickered there, distant, blurred by years, but not entirely gone. She opened her mouth as if to say something. Then her pager beeped, a harsh, insistent sound that snapped the thread between them. She broke eye contact and walked on. Sam stood alone in the corridor, the mop still untouched. His heartbeat thudded against his ribs, louder than any alarm. Behind the glass, a child fought for breath. In the files of a distant medical board, his name was still printed in black ink beside the word revoked. And in the space between those two realities, between who he had been and who he was allowed to be now, there was a decision forming, quiet and impossible. In the ICU, the monitors kept their steady rhythm. In the surgeon's lounge, Evelyn stared at the scan on a tablet, tracing the tumor's outline with a fingertip she wished were less human and more machine. On the polished floor of the hallway, a janitor's cart squeaked as it shifted an inch, as if its owner had taken one reluctant step out of the safety of the shadows. Somewhere, between all of them, the scalpel waited, not in a tray, not in an instrument set, but in the future they were all about to walk into, whether they were ready or not. When the night shift officially began, the hospital lights didn't change, but the air did. Daytime chatter thinned into a low murmur, the edges of every sound sharpening in the quiet. The pediatric ICU felt like a glass island floating above a dark ocean of corridors and machines. Nurses moved with practiced calm, adjusting drips, documenting vitals, checking small bodies wrapped in wires and cotton. Outside Emily's room, Daniel was still standing, his posture slightly more slumped now, his exhaustion bleeding through the layer of adrenaline that had kept him upright all day. A nurse gently suggested he sit. He tried. He lasted 2 minutes before standing again, as if the chair were a betrayal. His mind kept looping through fragments, the phone call that had dragged him out of a meeting, the way Emily's hand had suddenly gone limp on the kitchen floor, the ambulance ride, the first time he heard the word inoperable spoken as if it were a weather report. He replayed each conversation, looking for an opening, a loophole, something he might have missed, but every memory ended in the same place, a closed door and a surgeon's eyes looking away. Far down the hall, near the service elevator, Sam washed his hands at a stainless steel sink, scrubbing longer than necessary. The water ran over fingers that still remembered another rhythm, the ritual of pre-surgical scrubbing, The way the world narrowed to skin and soap and time counted in slow, precise seconds. He stared at his own reflection in the dull metal, seeing the lines carved deeper around his mouth, the streaks of gray that hadn't been there the last time he'd signed a consent form as the operating surgeon. It was strange, he thought, how a decade could feel like one long night where nobody turned on the light. He shut off the faucet and dried his hands on the rough paper towel. The motions were automatic, but his mind was somewhere else entirely inside a cold boardroom, facing a semicircle of strangers with polite faces and unforgiving eyes. He had stood there once, explaining a complication that had spiraled into catastrophe, describing seconds that had stretched into an eternity as a small heart stopped beating under his hands. He remembered the father's scream outside the OR doors, the way nurses flinched, the way no one blamed them because they still wore white coats instead of gilt. In the end, it wasn't one mistake that took his license, it was the narrative that followed. Risky, impulsive, unorthodox, labels layered over a man until his name sank underneath. He could have moved to another country, fought the decision in court, vanished into research. Instead, he chose something stranger. He stayed. Not in the same city, not in the same role, but close enough to smell disinfectant and hear monitors. Close enough to remember. If that was punishment or penance, he still wasn't sure. Now, with Emily's skin burned into his memory after only one glance, the old arguments began again inside him. You're not allowed. You're not qualified on paper. You're not safe. But another voice, quieter and older, whispered something else. Look at the image. Look at the anatomy. Look past your fear. It was the same voice he'd listened to as a young resident, when everyone said a case was too complex and he'd stayed up all night studying until he found a path no one else had seen. On the ICU monitors, the digits marking Emily's intracranial pressure crept slightly upward, almost imperceptible, like the first centimeter of water seeping under a closed door. The nurse at her bedside noticed, her brows pulled together, almost reflexively. She checked the line, recalibrated the transducer, watched for artifact, then saw the reading settle at a number that still made her stomach tighten. She documented it, added a note for the night resident, and glanced at the clock. The neurosurgery team had already signed off, with strict instructions: no surgical intervention, only medical management, only comfort. In the surgeon's lounge, Evelyn sat alone at a table littered with coffee cups and half-eaten sandwiches gone stale hours ago. Her tablet lay in front of her, the CT scan still open, the tumor glowing back at her in shades of gray. She zoomed in, tracing the margins again and again, as if repetition could change reality. She had done everything right, she told herself, followed the data, consulted colleagues, reviewed the literature. The risk was astronomical. The odds of waking the child up intact, able to breathe on her own, to speak, to walk, were microscopic. But there was a piece that didn't fit neatly inside the equation: Daniel's eyes. Something in them refused to accept the statistical obituary she was writing. It wasn't denial. She had seen that plenty of times before. This was something else, a raw, almost feral resolve. When she had told him they could not operate, he did not shout, did not accuse, did not beg. He just asked one question: if she were your daughter, would you still walk away? She had answered softly, professionally, skirting the knife's edge of truth. Hours later, the question still echoed in her bones. She leaned back in the chair, rubbing her temples. Her career had been built on knowing when not to cut as much as when to cut. She had turned down surgeries that would have turned her name into a headline. She had walked out of rooms when she knew the scalpel would be more for the doctor's ego than the patient's chance. That discipline had saved lives. It had also carved away little pieces of her sleep, night after night. There were faces she still saw in the dark: children she had operated on and lost, and others she had refused to operate on and lost anyway. Both wounds left scars, just different shapes. The door to the lounge creaked open. Sam stepped in, pushing his cart with one hand. It was just another room to clean on his list, a place of abandoned coffee and discarded bravado. He paused when he saw Evelyn, not expecting anyone to still be there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the vending machine filled the silence. "You're still here," he said quietly, surprised to hear his own voice cut through the air. It came out rougher than he intended, like a man who had smoked for years even though he hadn't. Evelyn glanced up, startled. Nurses and residents addressed her as doctor or chief, but the janitorial staff often just nodded in passing. It took her a second to place his face, not because she hadn't seen him before, but because she had never really allowed herself to look long enough. Tonight, something tugged at the edges of her memory. The calm in his eyes, the way his gaze had flicked toward the CT image on the tablet a moment earlier. Most people's eyes slid over scans like they were abstract art. His had focused. Could say the same about you, she replied, more tired than defensive. Long night, long decade, he almost said, but bit the words back. Instead, he nodded toward the tablet. That the girl in 9. Evelyn stiffened instinctively. Patient details were not casual conversation material, especially not with someone outside the medical team. Yes, she answered curtly. Complicated case. Sam stepped closer, pushing the cart until it rested near the doorway. His hands curled around the handle, knuckles whitening slightly. The urge to keep walking battled with a deeper, older impulse to step in, to say something that might shift the course by a few degrees. Complicated, he repeated, tasting the word. Or just Harry. Her eyes narrowed. I'm not sure I understand what you're implying. He exhaled slowly. If he pushed too hard, she would shut down, retreat behind policy and protocol. If he said nothing, Emily's chance at whatever it was would evaporate before sunrise. I saw the scan, he admitted, nodding at the tablet. I was in the hallway when it was pulled up earlier. I know I shouldn't have been looking, but some habits don't die just because a badge changes. Her gaze sharpened, the steel behind her professionalism surfacing. You know scans. There it was. The fork in the road. He could laugh it off, say he'd picked up a few things watching TV in the waiting room. Or he could open a door he'd kept locked for 10 long years. I used to, he said finally, the words quiet but steady. Before I traded an operating room for a mop bucket. For a few seconds, the room felt smaller. Evelyn's mind flipped through possibilities. Was he exaggerating, delusional, one of those people who romanticized past careers that hadn't really existed? Or was he what her intuition whispered he might be? A ghost from the surgical world, hiding in plain sight among bleach bottles and trash bags. Name, she asked, though her brain was already digging through old memories, conferences, journal articles. Samir Cole, he answered, using the full name he hadn't been called in years. But around here, they just say Sam. The syllables landed between them like an unexpected instrument dropped into the middle of a quiet piece of music. Her eyes widened by a fraction. She turned the name over in her mind, dust blowing off an old headline, a case study, a rumor that had made the rounds in surgical circles long ago. A pediatric neurosurgeon who had attempted an experimental resection on a brainstem tumor everyone else had refused, whose patient had died on the table, whose career had ended in a storm of debate about ethics and risk. She remembered the articles. Some had called him reckless. Others had called him brilliant but unlucky. She had been a fellow then, watching older surgeons debate his fate over coffee and conference slides. She had not known that debate would one day walk into her lounge pushing a cleaning cart. You're Dr. Cole. The title slipped out before she could stop it. Was, he corrected, a flicker of something painfully close to shame crossing his face. Now I'm the guy who makes sure your ORS don't smell like the last case. The air between them thickened with questions she didn't know how to ask. He spared her the first one. I'm not here to tell you how to do your job, he said. You've got the title now, the experience, the team. But I am here, and I did see that scan, and I know what it looks like when everyone's too scared to pick up the knife. Her spine straightened. It's not about fear. It's about responsibility. You of all people should understand that. He flinched, as if she had pressed a bruise. I do. Too well. He looked down at his hands, flexed them once, then lifted his gaze again. But responsibility cuts both ways, doesn't it? There's responsibility for what happens if you act, and responsibility for what happens if you don't. Evelyn's jaw tightened. There is a difference between offering a chance and offering false hope. The tumor involves her brainstem and major vessels. One wrong move. She dies on the table, he finished for her. Yes. And if you do nothing. Silence hung for a long moment. Somewhere in the distance, a code alarm chirped once, then stopped. Someone had pressed the wrong button, or a machine had glitched and been reset. In this room, no one moved. Evelyn swallowed. We keep her comfortable. We manage her symptoms. We let her father be with her. Sam nodded slowly. And when he wakes up in a year and realizes he let her go without anyone even trying. Do you think comfort will cover that kind of wound? His words weren't accusatory. They were almost unbearably gentle. That made them worse. They slipped past her defenses and went straight to the place where she kept her own regrets. You think I don't know what it's like to lose someone? She asked, voice low. You think I don't see their faces every time I walk into an OR? I live with that calculus every day. I don't need a janitor reminding me of the stakes. For the first time, something like anger sparked in his eyes, but it wasn't aimed at her. That's exactly why I'm saying this, he replied quietly, because you do know. And because right now, that knowledge is not just keeping you careful, it's keeping you frozen. He took a breath, steadying himself. I'm not asking you to be reckless. I'm asking you to listen to the part of you that became a surgeon in the first place. The part that didn't look at a child and think, legal risk, but anatomy and possibility. Look at that skin again. Not as chief of neurosurgery, as Evelyn, as the doctor who once believed she could thread a path through anything if she understood it well enough. Her eyes dropped to the tablet. The tumor stared back at her. For a wild second, she imagined Sam standing beside her at a planning station, arguing about approach angles and vascular territories, sketching out incisions on a whiteboard at 3 a.m. in a way that only someone who had lived in that space could. It was a vision both terrifying and compelling. You can't operate, she said finally, clinging to the one solid truth. You're not licensed. If something happened. If something happens, he interrupted softly, it will be because you chose to try. Not because I pushed you. I don't want your table, Evelyn. That door is closed to me. I made my peace with that mostly. But I can still see, I can still think. I can still help you plan, if you let me, or you can keep pretending you're alone with that decision when you don't have to be. Her heart pounded against her ribs. The idea was insane. It brushed against every boundary of ethics and protocol she'd ever been taught. Collaborate in secret with a disgraced surgeon turned janitor. Use his brain when the system had already stamped it as too dangerous to trust. If anyone found out, her own career could shatter. But beneath the fear, there was another sensation, one she hadn't felt in a long time, the faint, stubborn spark of possibility. Not a guarantee, not a miracle, just a narrow, fragile path where there had been none. What if you're wrong? She whispered. He held her gaze. Then she dies with a fighting chance instead of a scheduled farewell. And you live with that, the same way I live with mine. But what if I'm not wrong? What if there's a way through that tangle of vessels, and you are the one person in this building good enough to walk it? Outside, in the ICU, Emily's intracranial pressure crept another number higher. A nurse noted it and bit the inside of her cheek, glancing toward the empty hallway where the neurosurgery team should have been. Inside the lounge, Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they were different, still tired, still afraid, but clearer. She picked up the tablet, turned the screen toward Sam, and set it down on the table between them. Show me where you'd start, she said. His breath hitched, almost imperceptibly. He stepped forward, leaving the cart behind, and leaned over the image. His finger hovered above the glass, tracing invisible lines only he could see. For the first time in 10 years, his mind shifted back into the old groove, computation firing in patterns that had nothing to do with mops or cleaning schedules. In room 9, a monitor alarm pinged softly as a threshold was crossed. In the lounge, a fallen surgeon and a doctor on the edge of a decision bent over the same screen. Between them, a plan that could either save a child's life or destroy both of theirs began to take shape. For the next 30 minutes, the hospital moved in its usual steady rhythm, wheels rolling, monitors chirping, voices rising and fading through hallways polished to a mirror sheen. But inside the surgeon's lounge, time behaved differently. It tightened, narrowed, coiled around to people staring at the same CT scan as if the entire night hinged on the grayscale map glowing between them. Sam wasn't touching the tablet, not physically. His fingers hovered just above the screen, tracing invisible paths the way a violinist positions a bow before the first note. The old instincts were waking up inside him, but not recklessly. There was a steadiness to him that Evelyn hadn't expected. He wasn't the hungry young prodigy she'd heard rumors about. He was older now, tempered by loss, stripped of ego, carrying only the precision that had once made him extraordinary. The approach you're considering, he murmured, voice low, eyes locked on the tumor's borders, frontotemporal with subtemporal extension. It's clean on paper, but it gives you terrible visibility of the lower margins. Evelyn stiffened slightly, not with offense, but with recognition. He had pinpointed the exact flaw she'd spent hours wrestling with before her team had finally declared the case inviable. And if I go retrosigmoid, she countered, I risk losing the perforators. The vessels feeding the pawns are practically hugging the tumor in this region. Sam nodded, gaze flicking to the cluster of lines on the scan. True, but there's a corridor here, tiny, but real. See the angle between the tumor mass and the lateral recess of the fourth ventricle. If you enter just medial to the flocculus, you'd have to retract the cerebellum, she cut in, shaking her head. In a 9-year-old, the swelling alone, you wouldn't retract. His voice softened, like he was remembering something tactile. Gravity does it for you if the positioning is right. 30 degrees head tilt, no pressure, it's delicate, but it stabilizes the field. Evelyn blinked, not because what he said was impossible, but because it was elegant. Her breath caught, not in fear, but in the unmistakable jolt of recognition that hits a surgeon when they glimpse a path no one else had thought to look for. A corridor, barely a few millimeters wide, practically invisible unless someone had spent years navigating anatomy the way other people navigated city streets. She zoomed in, the tumor allowed a margin there, thin, risky, unforgiving, but real. Her heart thudded once, hard. Sam watched her process it, searching her expression the way only another surgeon could. You're seeing it, he said softly, not triumphantly, just a fact. You know it's there. It's too narrow, she whispered, but the conviction had cracked. A light had slipped in through the fracture. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Only the hum of the vending machine and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights filled the room. Sam stepped back, giving her space, though his mind was still visibly churning with possibilities. Even if the corridor works, Evelyn finally said, leaning back in her chair, we'd still need vascular mapping, neuronavigation, an OR, the entire pediatric team, anesthesia, post-op ICU, and the board will never approve it. Sam nodded slowly. Then don't ask them yet. That's not how this works, she snapped, tiredness fraying her voice. There are protocols, processes. Even if I believed this was possible, and I'm not saying I do, the system won't let me even consider it. He studied her for a moment, then asked a quiet question that softened something in the air around them. When did you stop trusting your own hands? The words hit like a sudden drop in altitude. Evelyn looked away sharply, jaw tightening, breath stalling halfway out of her lungs. She didn't answer. Instead, she pressed her fingers to her eyes, squeezing until the pressure steadied her. Sam exhaled gently, almost regretful. I'm not trying to challenge your authority. But you're letting the hospital think for you. And hospitals, they're built to say no. Built to protect themselves. Her shoulders sagged. For the first time since she'd seen Emily's scan, she looked less like the unshakable chief of neurosurgery and more like a human being drowning under the weight of a decision that had no safe outcome. Sam, she whispered, voice cracking just slightly. If this goes wrong, if she dies, she's dying anyway, he replied quietly. This isn't life versus death. It's death for sure versus life maybe. The honesty was brutal. And true. On the ICU floor, Emily's vitals took another dip, subtle but significant. A nurse adjusted the ventilator parameters, her eyes flicking nervously to the hallway where no surgeon had appeared all night. Back in the lounge, Evelyn closed her eyes again, and something inside her shifted, a tectonic plate of fear grinding against a plate of possibility. When she opened her gaze, the exhaustion was still there, but something steadier had replaced the paralysis. I'll need a full plan, she whispered. Every angle, every risk, every anatomical variation. If I'm going to fight the board, if I'm going to fight the ethics committee, if I'm going to take her to the OR, I need the cleanest blueprint I've ever walked into a surgery with. Sam swallowed hard. Over the last 10 years, he hadn't let himself imagine being part of something like this again, not even in dreams. He nodded once, deeply. I'll help you build it, he said. But it has to be your hands, your team, your operating room. I won't be anywhere near it. Evelyn believed him. And yet, looking at the way he mapped invisible pathways in the air, she also realized something unspoken. She didn't want him near it. She needed him in it. Before she could voice that dangerous thought, a voice crackled over the intercom. Dr. Hart to the pediatric ICU. Dr. Hart to the pediatric ICU. Patient in room 9 showing signs of rapid decline. Evelyn froze just for a heartbeat. Sam went still, breath held. Then everything moved. Evelyn grabbed the tablet, shoved past the table, and ran. Not walked. Ran. Sam followed, not in her footsteps, but parallel, down the service hallway he knew better than most residents did. Years of cleaning the same floors had carved a different map into his brain, one that reached the ICU faster, quieter, unseen. Emily's monitor alarms were beeping in overlapping tones when they arrived, her intracranial pressure spiking, her heart rhythm losing its clean shape, her breaths shallow and delayed. Daniel stood by the bed, eyes wild, gripping the rail with both hands as if he could anchor her by sheer will. When he saw Evelyn, a raw sound tore from his throat, desperation, hope, and terror all fused into one broken syllable. "Please," he whispered. "Please do something." Evelyn looked at Emily, then at the numbers, then at Sam, who stood in the doorway, half hidden behind his cart, but their eyes met with the force of a choice that was no longer hypothetical. In that moment, the decision crystallized inside her. She turned to the nurse. "Prep an emergency neurocart," Evelyn ordered, voice steady, sharp, alive. "Call anesthesia. Get the OR ready. We're operating." From the doorway, Sam closed his eyes, not in fear, in something that felt painfully, dangerously like hope. The ICU shifted into a controlled storm the moment Evelyn spoke. Nurses moved with quiet urgency, their steps swift, their hands steady, their faces tight in that way people look when they know the outcome of a night will live in their memories for years. The alarms didn't scream anymore, they pulsed, rhythmic and insistent, as if marking the seconds Emily had left before the swelling inside her skull crossed a point no surgeon could reverse. Evelyn stood beside the bed, her palm hovering near the girl's forehead, feeling the faint warmth still lingering there. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Her silence carried a decision that reached deeper than protocol, deeper than fear. It carried every ounce of responsibility she had tried to bury under caution. Daniel watched her with a kind of trembling trust that made her chest tighten. She could see the exhaustion in his shoulders, the way his breath caught each time Emily's monitor dipped even slightly. The desperation wasn't loud or chaotic, it was suffocating, the quiet terror of a father who had spent hours being told there was nothing left to fight for. Now, with one sentence, she had given him the smallest fragment of something he'd almost forgotten, the idea that someone was still willing to stand between Emily and the darkness pulling at her. Sam stood in the doorway, unseen by most of the staff, his cart tucked against the wall like a barrier between who he had become and who he used to be. He stayed back, letting the medical team flow around him, but every detail seared into him with unbearable clarity: the rising intracranial pressure, the shallow breaths, the subtle twitch in Emily's fingers signaling another surge of swelling. He knew these patterns intimately. They were the same signs he had lived through in operating rooms he once commanded with absolute focus. Now he watched them as an outsider, a ghost haunting a world he no longer had permission to touch. Evelyn called out orders with a calm that hid the quake beneath her sternum. She told the respiratory therapist to adjust the ventilator, instructed the nurse to draw up Manidal, asked another to page the senior anesthesiologist. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating crises, but inside, a storm built in her ribs. The corridor Sam had shown her replayed in her mind like a quiet hum, threaded through each decision she made. She didn't let herself think about the board, the consequences, or the articles that would appear if this failed. She thought only of the anatomy, the narrow path, the quiet pulse of possibility she couldn't unsee. Daniel took one step closer to her, his voice breaking when he spoke. Is she still fighting?" It wasn't just a question. It was a plea to understand if hope was still allowed in the room. Evelyn didn't take her eyes off the monitor. "She's holding on," she said softly, not promising survival, not offering certainty, just refusing to let him drown in silence. "We're going to try everything we can." The hallway outside filled with hurried footsteps as staff prepared the OR. A stretcher rattled into position, the clean white sheets waiting for a child who had already endured more than her small frame should have carried. The air smelled of antiseptic, adrenaline, and something else: unspoken resolve, fragile but real. Sam lingered in the doorway, torn between the life he had lost and the one he had forced himself to accept. He knew that when they wheeled Emily away, his role in this building should end at the threshold of the ICU, but watching the way Evelyn's eyes traced every rise and fall of Emily's chest, the way her hands hovered with reverence instead of fear, he felt the old instinct rise again: protect the surgeon, Protect the patient, hold the line where the world narrows to one table and one chance. As the nurses moved to transfer Emily to the stretcher, Evelyn reached out, brushing a strand of loose hair from the girl's forehead. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but it grounded her. It reminded her that she was not fighting a tumor in abstract. She was fighting for a child whose father was quietly breaking beside her. She straightened, exhaled once, and stepped back. "Let's move," she said. The team lifted Emily with practiced care, transferring her onto the waiting stretcher. Daniel walked beside them as they pushed into the hallway, his hand clutching the rail, afraid to let go. Evelyn followed, her coat brushing against the walls, her pace steady, her heart pounding like a drum echoing down the corridor. Sam watched them disappear toward the OR wing. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he stepped backward into the quiet of the service hallway, gripping the handle of his cart until his knuckles whitened. He had no place in the brightly lit rooms ahead. But as the echoes of footsteps faded, he whispered to no one, "Find the corridor, trust your hands." He knew she would hear those words in her mind long after he was gone. And somewhere far down the hall, in a room waiting for sterile lights to bloom overhead, Emily's life hung suspended in the narrow space between a surgeon's fear and the fragile, stubborn spark of possibility that had led them all here. The operating room glowed with that cold, perfect brightness that erased shadows but not doubt. Evelyn stood at the center of it, already in sterile gown and gloves, the cap tight around her hair, her face half hidden behind the mask. But her eyes carried everything: fear, resolve, and that razor-thin line between the two where true decisions are made. Around her, the OR team prepared in quiet motion. Anesthesiologists adjusted lines and set the ventilator. Nurses laid out instruments with the reverence of ritual. A neuromonitoring specialist connected electrodes to Emily's small limbs, watching for the slightest disruption in her neural signals once the cutting began. The room hummed with machines, with measured breaths, with the weight of what no one dared name aloud. Emily lay at the center of it, her body small under the sterile drapes, her lash still and soft against her cheeks. A child carved down to essentials: breath, pulse, fragile anatomy caught in a battle she never chose. Daniel had kissed her forehead minutes earlier before being gently guided out. He stood now in the family waiting room, hands clasped together so tightly the blood fled his knuckles. Every tick of the clock hurt. He didn't know if it was counting forward or counting down. Far from the sterile glow of the OR, in the quiet service hallway outside, Sam leaned against the wall beside his cart, eyes closed. He had scrubbed floors in that OR 100 times. He could picture every corner, every vent, every tray. He could picture exactly where Evelyn was standing. He could see the corridor inside Emily's brain as clearly as if it were mapped on the wall in front of him. His fingers twitched, remembering the precise angles, the invisible margins. He whispered the path under his breath, not because she could hear him, but because he needed to believe that somehow the knowledge he'd given her was enough. Inside the OR, Evelyn stared at the CT image pinned to the monitor one last time. She wasn't searching for new answers. She was steadying herself to trust the ones she already had. She lowered her eyes, exhaled slowly, and extended her hand. Scalpel. The instrument touched her palm like a promise she couldn't take back. She placed the first incision with a smooth, even stroke. The room felt quieter, as if the air itself held its breath. Each layer she cut through demanded precision. Skin, fascia, muscle, the delicate architecture of a child's skull. Every millimeter carried the memory of Sam's voice tracing the route through the narrow corridor. She worked slowly, deliberately, not fighting the anatomy but listening to it. When she reached the door of the final membrane between her and the brain, the anesthesiologist announced a slight dip in blood pressure. Nothing dangerous yet, but a reminder that time was not theirs to command. Evelyn nodded and opened the door with microscopic care. The brain appeared, glistening under the light, breathing with its own faint pulse. Now the corridor mattered. She angled the microscope, adjusted the headrest tilt, and gently allowed gravity to draw the cerebellum just far enough to reveal the tiny space Sam had shown her. It was narrower than she remembered, almost impossibly so, but it was there like a secret passage only visible to those who believed it existed. Her breath hitched, her hand steadied. She entered. The tumor rose into view, pale and monstrous, curled around vessels like a vine strangling a young tree. Every structure pulsed with life, danger, meaning. But Evelyn moved with a grace that belonged only to surgeons who understood that hesitation could kill just as easily as overconfidence. She cut, cauterized, suctioned in movements so smooth they looked rehearsed, though no rehearsal could prepare for the reality of a living brain in crisis. Minutes stretched, folded, disappeared. Sweat traced the line of her spine. Her eyes burned, her fingers numbed, but she didn't stop. At one point, a vessel shifted, too close, too sudden. The neuromonitoring alarms chirped, a nurse gasped. A tiny drop of blood threatened to bloom into catastrophe. Evelyn froze not in fear, but in focus so sharp it bordered on instinct. She stabilized the vessel with a single perfectly timed motion, the kind of motion that came from years of training sharpened by one impossible night. The alarms quieted. She continued. At last, after what felt like crossing a mountain ridge blindfolded, the tumor began to separate from the brainstem. A narrow margin formed a miracle made not of divine intervention, but of anatomy, planning, and the shared belief of two people who had dared to see possibility. When she lifted the final fragment of the tumor into the sterile bowl, no one spoke. The room just breathed. Slowly, the pressure in Emily's brain eased, her vitals steadied. The tension in the room released by degrees, like a fist gently unclenching. Evelyn stepped back, her gloves trembling. "It's out," she whispered, voice breaking. In the waiting room, a nurse approached Daniel. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. Her eyes carried a brightness he hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. "She made it," she finally said. "She's stable, Dr. Hart. She got it out." Daniel dropped into the nearest chair, covering his face as relief crashed over him so violently it felt like grief. Down the service hallway, Sam closed his eyes and exhaled with a shudder, lips parting in a quiet smile that didn't quite reach the sadness in his eyes. He didn't celebrate. He didn't step forward. He didn't expect thanks. He just whispered, almost tenderly, as if speaking to a memory of his own. "Well done, Evelyn." Days later, when Emily opened her eyes for the first time, her father's tears wet her hand before she could even fully focus on him. She didn't understand everything that had happened, but she understood he had stayed. She understood she was alive. Evelyn visited quietly, standing near the doorway, watching the girl speak her first soft words, the ones that proved her brain had survived the impossible journey. Daniel tried to thank her, but Evelyn shook her head gently. "She saved herself," she murmured. "We just gave her the chance." Outside the room, a janitor pushed a cart down the hallway, humming an old tune. No one noticed the way he paused when he passed the door, or the small, knowing smile that flickered across his face. He didn't need a badge to know what he had done. He didn't need a title to feel the weight lifted from him, and he didn't enter the room. Sometimes the greatest miracles are carried out by hands that never touch the patient, only guide the person who can. Thus ended the night that 22 surgeons refused, and one forgotten man helped illuminate a path through the darkness.